Okay, everyone. Now we have Leigh Raiford and Delphine Sims.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming. I know a lot of you were expecting a conversation between myself and Sarah Lewis. Unfortunately, Sarah cannot be here. She texted me at 6:30 this morning making sure that I convey how disappointed she is to not be able to be here. But she is in the room, and especially I think her work on vision and justice in the image and in photography really certainly has given me a language for thinking about really what the work is that I do. I also am, let's see, am I speaking into the mic? Okay. My mother gets very disappointed when I don't speak into the mic. So, okay. And of course, I'm also just thrilled and humbled and always excited to be in any conversation with Dr. Deb Willis, who honestly, I don't know any other way to put it, but without her work, I could not do what I do. Most of us could not do what we do. And so in sort of thinking about today, I returned to really, I think, one of the kind of grounding books for me, Picturing Us, the edited volume, which I think lays out in so many ways the key tenets of Deb's practice and of the work that have provided a model for my own. I think first the sense of the need for archival research, of really doing the work of uncovering these archives and these images, of providing an intellectual framework for how we understand the role of photography in Black life, and in Black life both publicly and politically, but also, as we saw personally, in terms of familial, private-wise. So that has been really key. I think also Deb's practice as a practitioner, as a photographer as well as a curator, and then finally her collaborative work and her mentorship, which I think also is, for me, is all part of why she is so important to the field and as a model for what we do. And I was listening to you and I realized how much of what I'm about to present is so indebted to your scholarship and just your presence. So thank you so much. So what I'm going to present today is a project that I've been working on for the last few years. Since about November 2016, I have been leading a small team of photographers, scholars, including Delphine Sims, archivists, helping former Black Panther Communications Secretary Kathleen Neal Cleaver organize, catalog, and digitize her personal family photograph collection. And so it's, I've been working on it in sort of two ways. First, as I mentioned, sort of helping this team do the kind of the organizational work on the archive, and then also as a scholar focusing on one particular aspect of that of the collection, which is a family photo album. So we'll talk a little bit about that. A family photo album that Kathleen made in the 1980s about the family's time living in exile from the United States when they were in Algeria from 1969 to 1975. So what I want to do is just, and the reading of the photo album is part of a book that I'm working on that today, the title is When Home is a Photograph, Blackness and Belonging in the World. But just to say a little bit about the archival project. So I got an email in the spring of 2016 from Kathleen Cleaver, which was a great email to receive, asking help for this archive. She knew our paths had crossed when I was a graduate student at Yale, and she was a law professor. And she also knew the work that I had done on the Black Panther Party, and I had interviewed her, and so she thought that I might be a good person to be able to talk about the the work, someone who's knowledgeable about the history of the party, but also about the affective charge of the photographic image as well. And so we've been working, just sort of working on these materials. But what's remarkable about the collection is that it's not just kind of rich in the period of the Black Panther Party, which one would expect. And indeed, Kathleen, part of the reason that she has so many photographs from that period is that she started to collect images that people took of her. It was a way of kind of controlling the circulation and iconization of her own image, was that when people made photographs of her, she demanded copies for herself. And from that, she also developed a host of relationships with photographers like Jeff Blankford, like Gordon Parks, and others. Her friendship with Gordon Parks blossomed through the time her partner, Sinclair Bourne, who was a documentary filmmaker who made a film about Gordon Parks. Kathleen served on the board of the Gordon Parks Foundation. So she's always had this kind of eye, I think, for photography, for image making, and the like. But also what's impressive about the collection is that it covers, she is the sort of the keeper of her family's collection. So the collection itself dates back, and here's Delphine working with Kathleen. But the collection itself dates back to the 1890s, starting with, let's see if I have them here. Nope, sorry. Let's see all the images. To about the 1890s with 2 lithographic transfers of Kathleen's grandparents. There are a number of photo albums of her aunt, Pearl, her aunt, who was an avid traveler. Photo albums of her mother, Pearl Jewett Johnson Neal, who was the first African-American woman to earn an advanced degree in mathematics from the University of Michigan. She's also an incredibly unique figure in that her father, who was a first professor at Tuskegee, in 1954 joined the U.S. Foreign Service, and over the next half dozen years, their family lived in India, the Philippines, Liberia, and Sierra Leone, and so the collection also holds those images as well. The photographs, I think, in the collection they document the Neal family's participation in Black and Brown nation building and transnational freedom dreaming. So it's an incredible, absolutely incredible collection. It's about 2,000 images. Let's see if I can find you. These are some of the sort of the most iconic. Here are images of her parents, Pearl Jewett Johnson Neal, Dr. Ernest Neal, holding her passport from 1956. These are images of her father and her parents in India and Sierra Leone. Here in the Philippines. So there are about 2,000, maybe 2,500 images or photographs, and counting. It seems that every time Kathleen opens a closet, there's another bag of photographs that she uncovers. And the images, are up until yesterday, right? So her family, her grandchildren, Panthers, former Panthers in their current moment. So it's a really rich archive that is really going to, I think, transform the way we understand not only the Panthers, but also just Black life internationally from moving forward. So what I want to do in the remainder of the time, though, is really talk about the photo album itself, and think about how we can think about the photo album in the way that Dr. Willis talked about as a form of storytelling. And one of the questions that I've been thinking a lot about is what kind of story does a family album tell? especially at thinking about it as this photo album as a Black woman authored text that offers us another way of thinking about how we can talk about Black women's lives. So sometime in the early 1980s, Kathleen Neal Cleaver, former Black Panther, former political exile, almost former wife of the FBI's most wanted revolutionary, and now a 30-something Yale undergraduate mother of two, sat down to compile a family album. Oh, sorry, these are some of the older images. Okay, there we go. Though her children, Maceo and Joju, were now adolescents, there were no albums that gathered together photographs of their baby in early childhood. Maceo Eldridge Cleaver was born in Algeria on July 29, 1969, a little over a month after Kathleen arrived there to meet Eldridge. Eldridge had fled the United States in late 1968 after engaging in a shootout that ended in the police slaying of 17-year-old Bobby Hutton, the Panthers' first recruit. Facing attempted murder charges, which would surely result in a death sentence for an ex-convict and outspoken radical, Eldridge jumped bail and fled first to Cuba and then Algeria. When Kathleen became pregnant with their second child the following year, 1970, let's see if I can, I'm not sure, how do I get this to play? There we go. Eldridge urged Kathleen to travel to North Korea. According to Kathleen, Eldridge was unsatisfied with the quality of medical facilities in Algiers, but there were political motivations as well. During the first year of Maceo's life, Eldridge cultivated strong ties to North Korea, a socialist nation state that offered both a model of third world independence and juche, or self-reliance. And it was part of Eldridge's Asian strategy, which provided legitimacy for the fledgling Panther embassy in Algeria. So formally invited by the North Korean Democratic Women's Union, Kathleen, with Maceo in tow, arrived in Pyongyang on June 2nd, 1970. Eldridge followed and arrived not long before Maceo celebrated his first birthday, and Kathleen gave birth to their daughter, Joju Youngie, on July 31st, 1970. This is a super cute photograph of Maceo on his first birthday. And this picture, let's see if I can make this work. This picture is the First Lady of North Korea leaning into Joju's crib. So the children's names in part chart the path of their parents' journey in exile. Maceo for the 19th century Cuban revolutionary Antonio Maceo, and Joju Youngie, a Koreanized name which roughly translates to rare heroine or young hero born in Juche, Korea. So the Cleavers returned to Algiers the next month and began the work of what we might call revolutionary homemaking. The children would spend their early years romping in the Mediterranean and running around 3 different apartments in which their family resided. They were held and entertained by visiting Black Panthers, foreign dignitaries, and an international host of comrades and allies in an organized communal nursery in their various homes. Maceo and Joju were looked after alongside the young children of other Panthers who joined Eldridge and Kathleen in Algiers, either in voluntary or forced exile. Kathleen was responsible, here's some pictures of the nursery. Kathleen was responsible for packing and unpacking and packing up again the family's belongings. It was her job to at once make a comfortable home while keeping it mobile and ready to move. She packed up the house on Pine Street in San Francisco and then within Algiers to the 2 different apartments that they lived in. And Kathleen had carried with her what photographs she could from Algeria to France and eventually back to the US. But this represented only a small portion of a much larger archive, reportedly lost in the move. I was livid, she recalled, because one of the biggest trunks we had in Algiers was filled with books and photographs. I had made arrangements for someone to ship it, but it never made it. The CIA took it, she laughed. French intelligence or US intelligence have it. For the repository and assemblage, Cleaver chose a fairly unremarkable of standard album intended for scrapbooking. here in the relative column of her New Haven apartment, no longer parenting 2 children under the age of 5, no longer living as a declared enemy of the US state in fear of her husband being extradited, imprisoned, or assassinated, Kathleen Cleaver assembled and memorialized the story of their family's years living in Algeria. So there are a lot of different kinds of photographs in the collection. Some of them are in the album. Some of them were made by state officials. Some of them were made by friends and sent to them. But in all, they're being curated by Cleaver in this nondescript, mass-produced album to tell the quotidian story of a family living under most extraordinary circumstances. So I think while we can think about the photography collection as clearly having great political and historical significance, I think it's best understood as a family archive. So I want to think about then, right, what kind of story does a family photo album tell? How does photography make home? And I think Deb will showed us that so beautifully. And this was, very true of Kathleen's family as well. Family portraits and documentation were important to the Neal and Johnson families, no matter their geographic location, whether the American South or the global South. My family always had pictures, Kathleen emphasized. My mother had photos and albums. When I was growing up, pictures were accessible to everyone, especially with Brownie cameras. And Kathleen is particularly proud of the commissioned family portrait here by famed African-American photographer P.H. Polk at his Tuskegee studio. So one of the ways I've been thinking about the kind of how we can think about the fullness and complexity of this album and how it can kind of teach us to read and see Black radicalism otherwise, to read and see Black women's lives otherwise, is that I've been thinking about it through the lens of the curatorial. And I think, right, it's become really popular and maybe overused and maybe played out a little to call something curated, right? Everything's curated. And I think there is a fetishization of the figure of the curator. Both terms have come in to stand for an individual brand rather than a community-based practice. So naming Kathleen's work as curatorial has offered me an umbrella term for author, leader, activist, caregiver, and icon. By curatorial, I mean, yes, the process of selecting, organizing, arranging, and looking after the items in a collection, but I'm also referring as well to the necessity of collaborating with others, especially artists, to realize a community, or what bell hooks might call a home place. And I'm thinking of what it means to build community with and through art at the center, to hold space and to engender a sense of belonging, knowingly impermanent and contingent, ephemeral but no less real, and to develop, intervene in, or control a narrative. So in these meanings, my use of the curatorial returns the role of curator to its Latin root, curare, as a practice and model of caretaking, and connects us to Black feminist ethics of care. Koyo Kua, who is the current director of Zeit's Museum of Contemporary African Art in Cape Town, South Africa, has described her curatorial practice, which I think has offered a real model for my own thinking. And she defines it as to defend sites of criticality and dreaming, to care for the health and vitality of our society, and to engage with new and undervalued artistic practices. So to kind of get into this work of curating, and I don't have a lot of time left, but I want to sort of look at one particular image. There we go, this one. One of the few images in which Maseo and Jojo appear alone together without one or both of their parents. They are nestled into a single chair, side by side, their arms touch. Even so, there is room to spare, which gives a greater view of the chair. So if I have time, I'll come back to the chair's really cute occupants in a moment, but I want to first talk about the chair itself. A relatively straightforward piece of furniture, the seat and back of this Carver chair, which is an early American design, is upholstered in zebra print. According to Kathleen, this chair was one of her favorites, and featured prominently in the San Francisco home she shared with Eldridge from 1967 until she left to join him in Algiers. It was one of many African-themed items in their house. Animal prints, carved masks, shields, and spears. And so the zebra print, of course, is reminiscent of the iconic image of Huey P. Newton, a photograph that we know was staged by Eldridge Cleaver in May 1967, who was very aware of the image and power of personality. But we can expand our thinking about that, knowing that those, so thinking about how those artifacts or replicas came from the Cleaver's home encourages us to think more carefully about how quotidian objects become powerful conduits of diasporic connectivity. And Kathleen describes this in her essay, Back to Africa, the evolution of the international section of the Black Panther Party, when she writes of the significance of such a connection, specifically in the context of a Panther delegation trip to Congo-Brazzaville in 1972. And it was a group yearning to be hailed as family by their African hosts. She wrote, "The desire to return to Africa was always a powerful undercurrent in the Afro-American experience. The hunger to see the land where their ancestors were captured and brought as slaves to America remained ever present among Blacks struggling to express their identity in a white-dominated world." And so these sort of what Jacqueline Nassy Brown has called diasporic resources offered a kind of a sense of movement and mobility, right? An expression of connection across space and time, even especially in a condition of immobility and stasis. So the spears and shields were items that one admired as art and lived with, but the chair, a place of rest and momentary settling down, was something to be lived in. The centrality of the chair has implications for how we read the photography of Black liberation writ large. So on one hand, we can think of the photograph in the album as confirmation of the kind of foundational approaches to how we think about diaspora and how we think about Black radicalism. So visualization of the forced mobility of some of the most iconic figures of the Black radical tradition. But the album also offers a depiction of homemaking that is itself a kind of aspiration to the quiet and stillness of the domestic quotidian and the tension between rest and motion. We can think about how, in Tina Camp's words, the Black quotidian functions as a signature idiom of diaspora culture and Black futurity for even those who are the most recognizable, most vocal, and most resistant figures in our political culture. So Kathleen loved this chair so much that she had it shipped from San Francisco to Algiers. According to Kathleen, this photograph of Maceo and Joju in the zebra print chair was made the day the shipment arrived from the States and into their second home in Algiers, in the suburban area of Hydra. They were unpacking the boxes, and Kathleen placed the children in her favorite chair. The chair, we might say, is as much a subject of this photograph as the children. So for the subject citizen who lives under conditions of uncertainty and hostility, home is always in motion. It necessarily has to be here and elsewhere. It's a respite and retreat that necessarily has to be mobile. Kathleen was no stranger to making a home internationally. She'd witnessed her parents, her mother especially, settle the family into living quarters in India, the Philippines, Liberia, and Sierra Leone. This upbringing as ambassadors or maybe agents, right, of the Cold War United States was, of course, a far cry from living in exile as enemy of the U.S. But one commonality for Kathleen was the need to create a familiar environment amidst persistent newness. And this proved no easy task. So while Kathleen writes that the Panthers were thrilled to be in Africa because of the place the continent held in their political and cultural imaginaries, the reality of living inside exile and the complexities of Algeria in particular made their experience a difficult one. Of the 30 Panthers living in Algiers at the height of the international section, only Kathleen spoke French, and no one spoke Arabic. None were able to comprehend the complex political situation or the histories that bound and divided Algeria's various ethnic, tribal, and religious groups. And for the women, as Kathleen remembered, quote, "We came with our big hair and our big hoop earrings and our short skirts." Now these are, of course, as we see upstairs, deeply iconic and celebrated in the US, but largely in transgression of expectations for modesty of female dress in Islamic Algeria. So the exuberance for Black liberation that brought the Panther contingent to Africa was dampened by their ignorance of Algeria. So returning to the photograph, we can see a kind of complicated color story at work in which the zebra print competes with the typical Islamic tile pattern of the floor. In the home she loved and protected in San Francisco, the chair was meant to invoke an Africanness, a diasporic resource that imagined and thus forged kind of a connection to an elsewhere beyond Babylon. Diaspora desire iterated through a material object. Now, in real Africa, real complicated Africa, the chair was a symbol of home and what was left behind. The photograph's elevations depict an imagined Africa sitting atop a real one, an idea that hovers above solid ground, and both support her children. Let me go one more time to this, back to this photograph. So, yeah.
Sorry, could you just show us where the tile floor is?
Oh,
It's hard to see.
oh yes,
There is tile there?
yeah. Mm-hmm.
Oh, it has legs.
Yeah, in the, under the legs. Mm-hmm.
Seemed like a stone.
So when I ask Kathleen what prompted you to put the photo album together, Kathleen has no answer. However, in 1982-83, Kathleen was writing her senior thesis in history at Yale, which she later published as one of the first one of the first academic volumes on Black Panther history. And that was the essay I mentioned before, Back to Africa. And I think it's no accident that these two narratives of the Cleavers' time in exile emerged at the same time. And we may even think of them as mutually constitutive. And indeed, working with Kathleen over the past few years, I've witnessed the way, oh, these are the pictures of her at Yale, also in the collection. I've witnessed the way memory cathects and history adheres to individual photographs for her. So the process of engaging with photographs, of holding them, looking at them, and to follow Tina Camp, listening to them, has emerged as critical to Kathleen's narration of her own life. I imagine that this hapticity was as true in the 1980s as it is now. So the article offers this detailed overview of a facet of Panther history, of which still little has been written, right? So this time in which there was an international section and the Panthers were really functioning as a kind of liberation, the sort of like ambassadors, right, of the Black liberation in this kind of, in the growing third world. But she wanted to write this foreign policy relations history, but she found it curiously difficult to find ample documentary support, right? So that would be befitting of a history thesis. And her firsthand knowledge didn't count. So she channeled her narrative into a kind of, or her work into a narrative history. But if we juxtapose the album, the Algiers album with the thesis come article, it helps us think more effectively about this question, what kind of story does a family photo album tell? So if the article is affective history, then the album offers affective history. And I think it's one that cannot deny negative affect or bad attachments like boredom, exhaustion, laziness, betrayal. And in doing so, I think it holds out the possibility of acknowledging the personal and political failures of the Cleavers' time in exile. Failure without the political impulse of redemption, that in the words of diaspora studies scholar Iana Owen, are so central to the Black left's revisionist narratives of resistance. So the article teaches us, but the album, as Owen would say, refuses to counsel us. And this is sort of thinking about how we hold on to a space for failure in our kind of thinking about narratives, right? So, and the failures are the ones in which Black people betray and cheat one another, misrecognize and refuse one another, shame and are ashamed of one another. So one of the failures of that era, and I believe in much of our subsequent scholarship about the Panthers, has been a kind of oblique address, but ultimately redemptive narrative about gender relations, which is, and one of the most egregious forms of intraracial failure, sexual violence and domestic abuse. So for sake of time, I can discuss that in greater detail during the Q&A. For now, I'm not prepared to argue that Kathleen deliberately recites the failures of the international section and of herself and her family in the album in the way the memoirists do, or the way people do in Owen's study. And I don't think that Kathleen is herself prepared to make such an admittance, but I believe that the family album as a form is too messy, too obstreperous to withhold, externalize, or deny entirely the failures and disappointments of familial relations. And I'm thinking of family here as at once the Cleaver nuclear family, the growing community of Black American exile families that lived under the Panther banner in Algiers, family as a metaphor for nationalism, and family as a map of intergenerational kinship and affective ties. So I'll finish with this page here, but we can take this as an example that in the early in the album, with only 2 remaining photographs. So from page tears and glue stains, it's clear that some photographs have been removed. So at the center, right, is a photograph of Kathleen in a mustard-colored dress on a terrace overlooking Algiers. Close to the right edge of the frame, Kathleen's attention is not on the city view, but directed softly at the newborn in her arms. From the captions to the left of and beneath the image, Hotel Uledi, July 1969, and Pan-African Cultural Festival, we can deduce that the baby is Maceo. Mother and child are in their own enclosed circle. Not only are they turned away from the city and the sea, but they are turned away from the photograph at the bottom left, which features a white-presenting woman in a maroon caftan standing in front of a wall of flowers, smiling directly at the camera. Beneath the photograph, Kathleen has written friend, but on the image itself, Kathleen has drawn a thick cartoon mustache. She does not recall the woman's name, but recalls that this friend was, quote, in love with Eldridge and made her way to Algiers to be close to him. In one retelling, Kathleen mentions that this was not the only friend who came to visit them in exile. Now, it seems a memory that a scorned wife might want to forget or excise. Instead, Kathleen chose to include this photograph in her family album and on the same page as a tender pietà, and to deface it in such a way that calls attention to a cascade of betrayals. As affective history, the Algiers album offers an archive of feeling, to borrow Heather Love's term in the context of queer histories of loss and injury. Love writes, quote, taking care of the past without attempting to fix it means living with bad attachments, identifying through loss, allowing ourselves to be haunted. On this album page, with its absent images and paper scars, Kathleen at once tends to the newborn baby while allowing the image of her husband's infidelities, marked by a belated clapback, to hover in close proximity. Actually, and I'm just do this last photo. We can also consider this photo of the new family, also made by Jeff Blankford, one of the few images in which the Cleavers appear as a family of 4. And Kathleen has expressed her dislike of this image. We look so bored with each other. And it's not difficult to see why. I mean, Kathleen and Eldridge are sitting side by side, their bodies leaning heavily against the back wall. The children fill all the space in between their parents and the camera. Kathleen is practically buried by the bundle of blankets that holds Joju on her lap. Eldridge makes a lackluster attempt at holding Maceo, who's slightly blurry, seems to be moving away from something outside of the frame, or maybe he's moving away from his father's lit cigarette, right? So it's like this family kind of crowded on top of each other, and the parents look exhausted, right? One child looks worried, the other child looks a heavy weight. But it's a photograph that stands in stark contrast to the glamorous image made by Gordon Parks of Kathleen and Eldridge in Algiers. It's a different sort of family photograph that has become iconic, one that imagines the young couple as unencumbered bolstered by their love for each other and their imprisoned leader, because there's Huey, and by extension, their love for the revolution. There's mystery in the moody shadows, whereas the family photo is brightly lit against an empty wallpapered backdrop. The Algiers album offers public images of Kathleen's strength and power, but it also does not deny private fear and disempowerment. So to finish, I just want to say that I think, many scholars of family photography have pointed out that the family album offers us a narrative, but one that is unruly and eclectic. It's multi-genred, it's at once repetitive and chaotic. It's a form that more often than not loses the plot. But we also have to understand, if we understand the family album as an act of communication whose suspended conversations are reawakened by subsequent engagements, then the genre allows for the possibility of different tellings each time it is open. The tattered pages and loosely affixed photographs suggest as much. So here in the Algiers album, nothing is fixed, not in the sense of having been cemented, nor of having been repaired. Indeed, any attempt to fasten a meaning or to resolve a story only proves fruitless, only invites more questions than it might answer. So I'm gonna leave it there. Thank you. It's like the Stevie Wonder album, The Secret Life of Plants.
Well, as everyone's probably thinking, you're truly incredible.
Oh, thanks, Delphine.
I am in awe of what you've theorized with this incredibly unruly project, and grateful to be able to witness where it is now, having been invited to take part in the summer of 2017. A lot to process because you've really taken this to whole new levels. But I wanted to work through different ways that we understand the history of the album and the history of photography. I wanted to think about how we are seeing somewhat singular pages and what it means to encounter the album as something that's meant to be turned and this arc of a narrative. But maybe the possibility that we are, and with Kathleen, are encountering the album with loose pages. So there's a way for us to reconstruct in a way. So maybe you could talk a little bit about what it means to flip through versus stay with a singular page.
Yeah. Thank you for that question. I think one of the hardest things, so in trying to think through this, one of the hardest things was really trying to think about the betrayal and violence, right? And I think Deb heard a very early version of this talk, and and Nicole Fleetwood said, well, how are you going to deal with the violence in the home, right? And how do you address that? And so one of the things I realized in the album is that the album, because it has so many, the story gets reopened and told differently every time, and then it's got so many different kind of hands on it. Joju Cleaver, I was talking to her the other day, and she was like, this album was I remember this album growing up, and my brother and my hands were all over it all the time. What I realized was that the album actually, there are many pages, and there are many stories that kind of continue, and there are all these other people who show up in the album later on. And so flipping through it, it's a reminder that that a single photograph, we imagine it as freezing something in time, right? But the kind of practice of photography, or what Ariel Azali calls the event of photography, is ongoing, and that we can really sort of have this experience, or be reminded of the kind of the way we bring a present to every engagement. And so that kind of flipping through, I think, just is a different way of connecting to that past. And I guess the last thing I will say, the hard part has always been getting Kathleen to not take every picture out and want to, frame it or put it elsewhere. And it's like, no, this is actually a really special document.
Well, yeah, let's talk a little bit about Kathleen and the haptics, and what that means for wanting to keep the archive in her home versus wanting to see it made publicly available to the world by adding it to a library collection. Why we need Kathleen to keep touching the photographs, because it conjures so many different memories with each encounter.
Yeah, well, I should say, so the collection is about to go to a formal archive. There's going to be an announcement in the next week or two. I think so one of the things that the sort of first rules that we realized was that everybody wears gloves but Kathleen, right? Right. So and in part that was part of the process of organizing. So I also want to say Delphine put together the database, right? She actually framed all of the questions and how we were going to begin to actually enter the photographs and think about what are the important things that we need to know about the images, and how we need to preserve them and how we can find them. And so part of the process then of being able to figure out where everything was going and where they belonged and who was in them was actually talking to Kathleen and sitting there with a pencil while she said, oh, this is so-and-so in this photograph, or this photograph happened, took place, it was taken X, Y, and Z. And right, we need that. And so that question that you asked earlier about how do we kind of use these family photographs or family albums to tell stories, I think part of it is about engaging that sense of touch and really being, and the smell of the album and engaging the senses. But I think I would also say that, whatever. I have a PhD from Yale, still had no clue what I was doing. Right? Like, this is not what so trying to kind of learn, learn how, I think, you learn, I learned a lot sort of in the doing. But yeah, so I think that kind of, but I think, right, it took part of the process too of the cataloging was preparing, I think Kathleen preparing herself to let go and to pass the archive on.
I want to attempt to channel the wonderful and incredible scholar that couldn't join us here today, Sarah Elizabeth Lewis, by thinking with vision and justice a bit, and this idea of citizenship. And this is sort of an extended question, but I wanted to think about the history of the photographic album as perhaps framed by Sean Michelle Smith as being part of a way to constitute whiteness. A way to generate a legacy of white belonging in the United States, a way to think about a connection to sort of a eugenicist movement to declare racial hierarchy. And maybe ask you to ruminate on that a little bit, considering this is an album of a revolutionary. This is an album of diasporic belonging and community. And what it means for us to encounter it, knowing this other legacy of the album as well.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really good one. It's a really tough one. I guess a lot what I've been thinking about is, so I think there are a lot of ways in which we, Black scholars, have approached photography, right? The photograph sort of always seems to show up as a site of violence. And of course, there are all these ways that we've had to, have a resistant gaze or an oppositional gaze or read against the grain. But what Dr. Willis's work has also shown us, right, is that the photograph isn't always a place of refusal and resistance. It's also, I think, this kind of, it's a, a place of invention and imaginary, and I think sometimes too that's some of that, our kind of thinking around that is so informed also by a kind of U.S. focus, because I think Delphine and I met in Bamako at the African at Bamako Encounters, the African Photo Biennial, and just thinking about all of the things that we kind of still don't know what photography can be and can do outside of colonialism, or sort of imagined through just other practices, and so I think that in some ways it frees us up to know that the history that Sean Smith identifies in kind of producing a white family, producing whiteness, right, and the kind of reproduction of whiteness in that way is one narrative. And so I keep coming back to all of the ways that, like in the book project, it's really about all of these Black radical figures and it's about their personal photographs. Like I'm really, and personal photographs that were experimental ways of trying to imagine something otherwise. And so yeah, I think we get something different. Yeah.
Thank you. We want to make sure you all have time to ask questions as well to Leigh Raiford. So please, yes, Darcy.
Leigh, that was such a fantastic talk. Thank you so much. It was really a couple things. I think you could do more with the fact that she chooses as her photo album a scrapbook instead of those photo album type pages that
Yes.
glue things, but also specifically about the chair with the zebra stripes, that she's cutting it out.
So that's actually that's a third part of the paper that got cut out. I'm thinking about cut and paste and assemblage. Yeah, because here actually
Your whole
I
sense
can
of
show
the
you.
mobility
Oh.
of the home.
Can I get back into the? Oh wait, maybe I don't know if this will work. Let's see. Okay, so here we can go. So right here here's the original photograph, and she keeps a version. So Jeff Blankford made these photographs, but she keeps a frame version of the photograph on the piano, right, in her living room. But it's the cutout version, right, that she places in the album. And so that was, I think, also, it helps us think about her labor, right, and her vision, and all of the ways that she, I think, also really was a kind of, like I said, some of the most famous photographs that we have of the Panthers are, Ruth Marion Baruch and Perkle Jones's portraits from 1968. It was Kathleen who sought them out and commissioned them to make those images. She was the one who found Jeff Blankford's photographs in a newspaper and said, hey, can you come photograph for the Panthers, right? So she has always kind of had this vision, this eye, that then she could sort of take that kind of personal taste and transform it into a kind of political statement, right, and political possibility. So yes, so sorry to say, yes, that was the part I cut out for for a time.
It works, I'm sure you get to this, but it works so well with your notion of the mobile home.
Yes.
And the placelessness of the diasporic condition, where the blank paper, we didn't see the tiles for us back here
Okay.
at all. It seemed like a stuffed chair. And by the way, it's a little creepy how the children seem to be absorbed in the cutout picture. The children are being eaten by that chair.
Yeah.
Really, you can hardly see them.
Yeah.
Anyway, that was just great.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah, I find it really interesting that you're working with a living subject.
Yeah, me
And
too.
I'm wondering if you could speak to how you navigate between what she's telling you
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That's I like old stuff. I like when the people don't talk back. So yeah. Yeah, that's been really hard. I think one of the things, well, first I really try to think of myself as wearing multiple hats and trying to be very clear about which hat I was wearing when. And this actually was the first time I presented. There was so Nicole Fleetwood raised this question about about violence, and Mark Seeley, who runs Autograph in London, was like, no, that's not your job. Your job is the archivist. You are here just to make sure the collection is available, right, and is organized. And so I tried really hard to kind of hold on to both of those. I think a lot of what I did, so for this is a lot of both sort of, listening to Kathleen, but also, just doing the research around it. So I'm fortunate Eldridge Cleaver's papers are at the Bancroft at UC Berkeley, so I spent a lot of time in those trying to read around and look at other images. I mean, always also the practice of photography is always just kind of, is looking, not looking, seeing, what's not there, where things show up. And then also trying to, and one of the hardest things I will say, was trying to figure out how to talk about violence and abuse. And there's a much longer section in the chapter where I really talk about the Free Kathleen Cleaver, and the where she appears on the cover, or she appears in the Black Panther newspaper with a black eye, right? And these multiple accounts through Elaine Brown and others. And so really, and my mother also, I spent a lot of time talking to my mother because my mother was a domestic violence counselor in New York. And so really trying to figure out how can we talk about these things? And I struggled also because it's not necessarily the story that Kathleen tells, right? And we've asked her, and she approaches it and she backs away. But I also felt that, though, as a scholar, what would be the point? Like, if I couldn't actually talk about this, my job is not to write a hagiography, right? So then just really trying to be aware, thinking about, well, how would I want the story of my mother to be told? How do I want my life to be told, right? Like, I'm a complex human being who made a series of choices, and not all of them, you may not approve of all of them, right? So just trying to balance that, but I think the thing that was, I think, most, I know I'm on the right track at this point because Joju, I gave this talk, the fuller version at Spelman a couple of weeks ago, and Joju Cleaver was there, and we had she's like, I've never heard a story, I've heard people my whole life talk about my parents, and I've never heard this story. And so we're in conversation about sort of what that means. And so I feel like, so all to say, I don't have an answer. I'm trying to be careful and thoughtful, and true to kind of all of the hats that I'm wearing. Thanks.
Oh, yes.
Being from SF State and having the first historically Black BSU, the Black Panther movement was a big part in that at our school. So it's interesting to me that you are working with a living legend who was so close to that. And my question to you is, seeing in some of the films where you said like she took some things out, she didn't put some things there. How was that dealing with watching her go through these motions, watching her relive certain things, the meaning behind her not wanting to have certain pictures or the memories of that, and how do her children feel from that aspect? Because you said that wasn't a story that was talked about, and that, like you said, you and Dr. Willis are giving us a lot of history that we don't get fed, that we don't know about. And a lot of women went through that in the Black Panther Party that a lot of people don't know of, you know. How was that experience, you know, to sit there and really watch her relive these things, and I don't want to explain that, you know?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a gift. You know, it is really, truly like, sorry, I actually am gonna get emotional.
Yeah.
To like see, and it's not just that it's Kathleen, right?
Yeah.
It's like all of our elders,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
That we get to like sit and hear their stories and build archives. Like the importance of building and keeping archives is so real. It is so like, in part, so we're not reinventing ourselves every time.
Yeah.
Also thinking, like, I'm been deeply inspired, I think like many people, by Saidiya Hartman's most recent book, Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments, which in part tells us that like everything we need to build a new future is already there, right? We just need to listen differently, and we need to think about the details differently, and we need to like spend more time with a single image or a single story or something, you know, that the details are there. And so I think, you know, I think that, so yeah, it is a gift. And I don't, you know, I don't necessarily believe that we need to, well, I'm just gonna leave it there. It's a gift, and I think everybody should take the time. If there is a family album in your house, and there is an elder, like sit down with them, record that, you know, record it in any way that is meaningful to you, because I think it actually helps us create new stories about who we are. It's a potential history, right?
On that note, should we take this into lunch? But please join me in expressing immense gratitude to Leigh Raiford. Thank you for doing this work. Thank you for doing the mediation.
Thank you so much. And Delphine, you did an amazing job. Thank you for coming in. Delphine came in, I'm just gonna keep it real. She came in at 9 o'clock last night. Thank you so much. We really appreciate you. We have lunch for you guys on the first floor, provided by Suya African and Caribbean Grill in Oakland. Please take 2 skewers first, and then before going back, so that everyone has food to eat. We are then going to have a performance by Tiffany Austin on the 3rd floor gallery. She is activating the Black is Beautiful exhibition with her beautiful sounds at 12:50. Also, we want to point out Moneta is in the back holding in her hand one of the amazing books that you can find downstairs. So that's Dr. Willis's Posing Beauty. We also have Let Your Motto Be Resistance. We've got Dr. Raiford's books downstairs. So yeah, also make sure that you check that out while you're down there. Thanks so much.